Well, good evening everyone and welcome to the launch of Promise and Performance, the Albanese Government's first term, edited by Dr. Scott Prasser. It's great to see you all here and it's a pleasure to be here with you. And we're bringing together a very distinguished group this evening of contributors to examine how the Albanese Government's first 3 years in office have measured up against its promises. Now, the book spans policy, politics and performance from foreign affairs to the public service and offers a rigorous assessment of what this government has achieved, where it's fallen short, and what it tells us about the state of Australian democracy. Now, the cast is large this evening. I think we've got 10 speakers, so I would ask you to extract the nuggets of what you had to say in your essay in a few minutes and hopefully leave us some time to have a larger conversation after this. And as each speaker comes up, I might get you to fill the seats here. Now, I do think we're probably a few short, in fact, because I can only count 6, but we'll see how we go as we proceed. Can I begin, though, by introducing our editor, Dr. Scott Prasser, who has held senior roles in the Commonwealth and Queensland Public Services and at universities around the country. He's the person who has made this project come together, and please make him welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Just to talk very briefly why this book. And we've tried to do this book really quickly after the first term because the media understandably quickly moves on to what Albanese is doing now and what the opposition is not doing now, and all the sort of crisis which goes on. So we thought before we lose the moment, before we forget what's happened the last 3 years, let's try and produce this book as quickly as possible. And so I got all our volunteer chapter contributors to do so, to try and get what it was like during this time. Now, there will be later volumes about the Albanese government as time moves on, and that will come up with different interpretations as more information becomes available. In 30 years' time, if you come back for another meeting here, you can listen to the cabinet documents have been released and all those sort of things. But I think it's really important to capture what it was like. And what the discussions were and what was at stake at the time. Because what's interesting about the Albanese government is almost everyone up to about January this year said it was going to be, a minority government or it was going to lose and all those sort of things. That hasn't come about. And that's one of the things we need to sort of focus on. So we've got a great cross-section of people and we've got a range of different views. And I'd like to thank David Easson. Michael Easson is not here yet, I don't think, who gave us the title of this book. I was saying, what are we going to call it? He said, call it Promise and Performance. Oh, okay, that's what we've done. So we're doing that. So we tried to cover all the main things that happen, all the public policy issues. And I asked people to say, tell us what the Albanese government did right. Tell us what you don't think it did wrong, but, don't just have an opinion. Try and back it up with some bit of evidence. Thank you very much. So we get to the truth of the problem. So I hope you enjoy all the different speakers from some of the contributors here tonight. It will give you a bit of insight and make you buy half a dozen coffees. It's coming up to Christmas time. I know you can't wait to put this on the stocking of someone or so on. I also want to make one more point about Concord Publishing. This book is printed in Australia, so we're really already honouring one of Albanese's promises about building Australia. We're already doing it. Okay, thank Albo.
Making Australia with all that cheap renewable energy that we're enjoying at the moment. Now, as I ask you to come, so I'll start with your name, and if you can start moving forward as I do that. Can I just say that there is, for those of us who are getting a little older, this is designed to trip over on both sides. So we'll come around this side because the trip hazard on that side is even greater than the one on this side. But Greg Melleuish, we'll begin with you, a historian and political theorist. Greg explores how Anthony Albanese and Jim Chalmers have crafted a new Labor narrative, one that draws less from Curtin and Chifley and more from the progressive politics of the 1980s. Greg?
Evening everyone. I'm Scott's narrative man for his various books. The problem with the Albanese government, of course, is that when I did narratives in the past, they were what people had written, whereas this is more about the narrative that is being crafted on the ground by the Albanese government, which is quite new, I think, and distinctive in many ways, because if you're a progressive and you're woke, then 90% of the Australian past is useless to you because it's full of racism, sexism, misogyny, God knows what. And so that makes the Labor tradition, the good old-fashioned Labor tradition, rather unusable in many ways. So how then do you craft some sort of new narrative? Well, there is one way that's unacknowledged that I put in the chapter, that the narrative that Albanese ultimately draws on, I think, is not Curtin or Chifley or so much, which is what they used to, got so upset about in the 1990s, but rather you can trace it in a genealogy, good academic word, from Evatt to Whitlam to Rudd. That's the genealogy that's there. And it's a new progressive, but you can't go back too far. So where's Albanese begin? I think Albanese begins in the 80s. That's why I think he's so obsessed with Medicare and his Medicare card, which apparently has many uses, so I'm told. And it means that the progressive starts in the 1980s. And it means that a lot of the old-fashioned Labor stuff has to be cut out. So what do we get instead? Well, what we get, I think, is a view of the history of the last, 15 years in which we've all been facing a lot of challenges. We're living through an age of crises. There's a lot of Schmittian ideas in the air, but it's one in which Albanese has crafted, and Chalmers have crafted, a theory of progress in which if you leave things to government, if you leave things to them, they will be able to solve all the problems of the universe in a seamless and effortless fashion. I mean, the classic example of that is climate change. They just fancifully construct a theory of progress, which is, to me, pure fantasy. But it's also true of a lot of other things as well. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is, when I say it's effortless, if you go back to older Labor thinkers, well, they talked about the struggle, the struggle they had to go through as members of trade unions and so forth. And they had a much more, they understood the world was a difficult place. In the new Albanese view of the world, even though there's a lot of trouble, we can just do it. All we have to do is come together and we can do it. And I think there's a second dimension to that, which I would think of as being therapeutic. In other words, we can solve your problems in a sort of therapeutic, sort of make you all feel better, make you feel good about yourselves, make you feel as if we can get to net zero without having to make any effort. We can just do it. We can just do it. There's no struggle. There's no hard work ahead of the Australian people. There's no, we're going to band together as a bunch of heroes and go to the light upon the hill. Oh no, just leave it. Business and everybody else will be able to solve it under the guiding hand of the great governor. Yes. So I don't want to say much more than that. So that's okay with everyone. That's sort of where I've been thinking and where I've been going. And the interesting thing, of course, about that, just as a final thing, is I think there is a problem with the narrative on the other side of politics, which has not been solved. And again, that they've lost their old narrative as well. But perhaps that's one of the reasons why Albanese has been so successful. He's crafted a non-threatening narrative, one that makes you feel good about yourselves. It's like taking your dose of soma every day.
Yes, the light on the hill is now an energy efficient bulb. The light on the other side has been snuffed out. I might call Malcolm Mackerras next, so start making your way forward, Malcolm. He needs really no introduction to this audience, who I know is across Australian politics for a very long time. Australia's best known cephalogist, Malcolm analyses the Albanese government's election performances, arguing that Labor's 2025 victory was wide but shallow. Malcolm? Come this way.
Okay, well, I'm going to begin with a quotation which I use very, very often. And this is the quotation. Electoral history is littered with unexpected landslides. End of quote. That was the favourite aphorism of my friend, the late Sir David Barton, 1924 to 2022, the eminent British cephalogist. The Albanese win is the latest example of this, but I can think of plenty of others. I was thought to be a super optimist by predicting Labor would win 79 seats in the House of Representatives, but Labor's final haul was 94 seats, so I underestimated by 15 seats, and I claim that other analysts performed even worse than I did. Anyway, I'm presenting the view that Albanese is a good vote getter, but I'm also presenting as an alternative the view that he is not such a good vote getter. However, I've been looking for precedents of previous elections to think of one that's quite like this, and the answer I've come up with is John Curtin in 1943 had a victory that's rather like this. So this is my statistic. During my lifetime, I was born in 1939 by the way, during my lifetime there have been 9 cases of a government seeking a second term. All 9 won the second term. The first case was 1943, when John Curtin won the second term in a landslide win, and with a 7.9% swing in favour of Labor. The next 7 elections, however, 1951, 1974, 1977, 1984, 1998, 2010 and 2016, saw a swing against the government even though it got its second term. At the 2025 election, however, there was a repeat of the 1943 election, though with lots of differences. The main difference, I would say, is that the Senate electoral system then was landslide prone. The House of Representatives system is still landslide prone, but the Senate electoral system was also landslide prone in 1943. So therefore, I think Albanese is only the second best election winner of the Labor leaders, though perhaps historians will say he's the third best. But he's certainly one of the best, and you'd have to say that the Albanese government, whether you like it or not, whether you defend it or not, is successful electorally. Now, the other thing I'd say about Albanese is this. I go in for laws of electoral history. Albanese has now challenged 3 of those laws of electoral history. The first one is the proposition that a government does not take a seat from an opposition at a by-election. It was said that this last occurred in 1919. Well, it happened under Albanese, so he broke that one. The next one, law of electoral history, was what I just said. Getting a second term, you can get it, but you always lose ground. He's broken that. Now, his third attempt at breaking the laws of electoral history, he tried to break the law of electoral history which says that a government does not get a referendum carried if there is serious opposition to the proposal. He failed to beat that law of electoral history. And so, what do I say about Albanese? I say, in one respect, he's rather like Bob Menzies. Bob Menzies in 1951 thought he could get an amendment to the Constitution which he wanted, and he was rebuffed. Now, his rebuff wasn't as statistically as severe as Albanese's, but psychologically it was. I remember it distinctly at the time. Bob Menzies made a resolution to himself, there will be no more referendums under my government. Now, I've noticed that there is another Prime Minister who made the same resolution.
Thank you, Malcolm. I can recently say that I interviewed John Howard for the dismissal, the 50th anniversary of the dismissal is this year, and he said You know that on the day of the dismissal, Malcolm Mackerras, my good friend, came in to see me and said, "You're going to lose your seat at Bennelong because of the dismissal." He said, "It was right, but in 2007. Now can I call on David Lee? David Lee is Associate Professor of History at University of New South Wales in Canberra. He assesses defence policy in Labor's first. Is David here? Yes, you are. Yeah, sorry. He assesses defence policy in Labor's first term, focusing on the AUKUS decision and its break with traditional Labor defence thinking. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chris. So in 2022, the Albanese government decided to maintain the essentials of the defence policies of the Morrison government. This involved the government committing to the trilateral AUKUS partnership with the US and the UK and the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines at the cost of $368 billion over 30 years. In doing so, the Albanese government moved away from the traditional Labor defence policies since Curtin, based on the defence of the continent and its air-sea approaches, to something akin to the forward defence strategy of the 1950s and 60s. The AUKUS decision was taken without either a comprehensive strategic review or a clear articulation by ministers of its underlying strategic purpose. The commitment was, moreover, subject to withering criticism by former senior ministers and prime ministers, strategists and naval experts. By 2025, the fervent hope of many of them was that the Trump administration would be able to save Australia from itself by ending an arrangement that appeared to some to resemble the interwar Singapore strategy. Whether this happens is something that's an open question. The review by the American Defense Department is still ongoing, and this is something that we'll be watching very carefully. Thank you very much.
I'm glad to see that Michael Easson has managed to join us. I know on the rush from Sydney. He's a businessman, Labor historian and former union leader. Michael examines the drift of Australian foreign policy, charting how the government has balanced hard and soft power while managing the China thaw and the AUKUS alliance. Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much, Chris and all. What a great topic to be focused on for the first term, given all the issues that the government will be dealing with in its second term. And I end my chapter by saying, I believe that the government grasps the challenges. The question is, are they up to meet those challenges? And we won't find out until the end of the next 3 years. But I start by referencing the changed strategic environment. And I've looked up an essay of one of my former teachers, Owen Hayries, and he gave the Richard Krieger lecture, and it was published 30 years ago. And he talked about, in the 21st century, Australia's strategic environment would change. We would no longer have a benign superpower interested in defending Australia due to the great goodwill that had been developed between our country and that superpower, the United States. Secondly, the superiority of Australia's economic strength compared to our region and our neighbours would dissipate as other countries rise, such as Indonesia and China, and therefore our ability to outspend anyone will be challenged as the world changes. And finally, he made the observation that the isolation of Australia, the tyranny of distance, would dissipate. What we would gain through telecommunications and speedier transport links would dissipate as we are closer to great powers. And all of that seemed very pertinent to think about in the context of foreign policy today. And I referenced the fact that the Albanese government came into office 15 months after the defeat of the Trump administration, and was re-elected soon after the re-election of the Trump administration. And I mentioned, as I begged for permission from the editor to keep going, I basically ended my draft in early June, and it struck me that amongst the great challenges was Trump and his isolationism, his repudiation of free trade. And I quote Lee Kuan Yew, who once referenced that the great catchment area of America is the world. And in a speech that he once gave to the American Congress, he said, whatever you do, please don't move away from free trade, which has been so vital to Singapore's development and so many other countries. And all of that is now very much in the balance given the Trump administration. I broadly say that the government has been thoughtful, strategic in most of what it's done in foreign policy. I'm critical of its position on the Middle East, on Israel and Palestine, and I reference that. So that's the one striking area of criticism that I raise about the government's foreign policy. And I believe that what I've tried to state is a fair and balanced account of the government. Thank you.
I now call on Richard Calver, who is an employment lawyer, a long-time industrial relations commentator, wine enthusiast. Richard dissects the Albanese government's industrial relations program, describing sweeping legislative changes that have yet to lift productivity.
You're right about the tricky method. Thanks for that introduction, Chris. I'm essentially a septuagenarian employment lawyer who's testament to the fact that old lawyers never die, they just lose their appeal. My chapter is about momentous industrial relations change, and I use that word deliberately. The changes to industrial relations made by the Albanese government in its first term were expansive and profound. There are around 1,400 pages of new law, 1,400, many of which are still being worked through by employers and unions alike. And a lot of those changes were due to be implemented in the second term of the Albanese government. The industrial relations changes, many of them have been staggered, so that the review, which was asked to assess the first tranche of the legislation, said that they didn't have enough information yet to assess the full extent of those industrial relations changes. I'll give you two examples of the staggering of those changes. The right to disconnect applies to employees of small business employers from the 26th of August 2025, a year after it applied to larger businesses. So, first of all, you test the right to disconnect with larger businesses, and a year later, it applies to small business. From the same date, that's the 26th of August 2025, eligible casuals employed by a small business can issue a notice to their employer in writing to change to full-time or part-time employment under what is known as the employee choice pathway, a completely new area of law that all employers must now become familiar with. And from the looks on your faces, not many people are familiar with. I use that area of law as an example of where the so-called closing the loopholes legislation has added to uncertainty, and uncertainty that took away from high court authority that gave precedence to the employment contract that casuals and others entered into. that certain and easy to administer test has given way to a situation where a casual employee can make a written request, as I said, to their employer to convert permanent employment if they have worked for their employer for at least 6 months for large businesses or 12 months for a small business, and the employee holds a belief that they are no longer covered by the casual employment definition. The new casual employee definition considers the nature of the employment relationship, not just how an employee is described in their employment contract. And that was an issue for employers before the High Court changed it to give it that certainty. The High Court said the employment contract sets out the relationship. Now this new law changes it back. So again, an area of uncertainty. If you're an employer who employs casual workers, you've now got to monitor what they do to make sure that you know whether or not they meet the casual definition anymore. So if they have regular and systematic engagement, and they're engaged for more than that 6 or 12 months, then you can expect to get from some employees a notice where they become either part-time or full-time employees. In my chapter of the book, I emphasise the importance of certainty. Uncertainty deters investment and negatively affects employment growth, and I cite authority for those propositions in the chapter. The main area of these multitudinous changes, as expressed prior to and during the election campaign which saw the Albanese government elected, was to increase the real wages of workers. That's what both Jim Chalmers, the two Ministers for Employment and Workplace Relations, and Albanese himself have emphasised. These changes will increase the real wages of workers. Yes, annual wage growth has been positive, but the industrial relations changes have not assisted flatlining productivity, which weighs on living standards. And that's the point that I make. That productivity is the thing that carries long-term real wages. And that's actually emphasised in Gary Banks's chapter, and we didn't even talk to each other when we make the same propositions. Ultimately, it's difficult for an economy to support real wage growth without productivity growth. Productivity has not been enhanced by the changes to industrial relations and by the embracing of uncertainty. Quite the opposite.
Our next speaker is Mike Kelly, former Army Colonel, MP and Minister, now Adjunct Professor at the University of Canberra. Mike discusses government services and digital transformation, highlighting progress and persistent gaps in digital literacy and public sector capability. Mike.
Thank you, Chris, and good to meet you for the first time, Scott. I will say, though, that if this is going to be a stocking stuffer, it'd have to be blue stockings, I'd say. But also, these are extremely challenging times for a government to be assessing a government. And actually, it's a perfect time to be a wine enthusiast. And given our current location, I'd add spirits to that too. But digital transformation, obviously, a very sexy topic, riveting. And certainly for politicians, I know that they can spell AI, and it's a useful phrase, digital transformation. None of them really understand any of that. But what I've highlighted in this chapter is that it's not just a problem of the failure in digital literacy of the political class, but also we have a deep problem in this respect in terms of our bureaucratic leadership at the secretary level, etc. And even lower than that, you will find the big challenge that government departments have is that all the best and brightest in this space are being snatched up by private industry because it is the keys to the kingdom. It's the most demanded skill set that there is in the marketplace at the moment. So you have a challenge there, and it's a challenge that not only spreads across the development of sound policy, but also in particular the procurement process for the sort of services and product that's so necessary. And you know, this issue of digital transformation and technology has been probably the most important in the last few years from this point of view of the two things that governments are there to do, which is to support their community and to defend it. And we have had some pretty stark failures, and probably the year 2016 will be known as the year of digital disaster, because that was the robo-debt saga, which you all know very well, and also the ABS's census catastrophe, all of which shattered public confidence in the sorts of digital transformations we need. And then, you know, we have compounded with that the running saga of the failures in the defence veterans services area, which has led to some really tragic consequences, as did robo-debt. And as a former member, it was really distressing to me to see how many of my constituents either suicided or went into incredible breakdowns and severe distress. So there is promise in that technology, but the ability to evaluate and procure in that space has led not only to, you know, these failures of delivery, but also in some terrible procurement decisions with vast wastes of money which have been surfaced by ANAO. And, you know, I'd say the government's record here is off the back of many generations of government failures. So assessed in that context, some progress has been made, but in the chapter you'll see I've referred to quite a raft of strategic areas that really no progress has been made in, and probably as a consequence that might explain portfolio changes we've seen since the last election in the technology space, and hopefully we will see improvements on that. But so far, I'm waiting to see signs of that being the case, although it was flagged as a priority in Jim Chalmers' first words on the night of the election, and also the Prime Minister's comments recently. So happy to talk more about that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I'd like to get you to start thinking about questions now, because they've been remarkably good. I've been surprised at the fact that they have actually delivered us nuggets, and we're going very well on time, so there's going to be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So start thinking about the things you might want to ask them now. I invite up now Paddy Gourley, now a former senior public servant, a commentator on the public administration, raconteur. Paddy reflects on the public service under Albanese, arguing that reform has been more rhetorical than real.
I think I can very confidently claim that my contribution to this book on the public service is far and away its most boring chapter. The thing about it is that public administration is just like that. So there's a certain inevitability in all of this, and it's something that doesn't have any grip in a political sense or in many other senses. It's a pity in some ways, because to the extent that the machinery of government doesn't work well, all government activity is discounted accordingly. Something that's often not well recognised. When the ALP was elected in 2022, it inherited an administration which was not in great shape overall, it having suffered from years of neglect, malevolence, and in some cases sheer stupidity in its management policies. The new government made lots of promises to fix things up, and to give it its due, it has done some things. But unfortunately, much of it is half done, some of it is trivial, and some of it is just plain silly. You pick what you like. There's the Anti-Corruption Commission, the replacement of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which contains the same appointment provisions to that tribunal, more or less, that were abused and gave way to the abolition of the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. The government has rooted out a lot of the corruption in staffing by using contractors when they should be using public servants, but they've done nothing to sandbag a repeat of that by changing legislation. And the less that is said about the Public Service Amendment Act, really the better. Nothing epitomises, in my view, worse than its inclusion of something called stewardship as a public service value. We now sort of seem to be a little bit in the doldrums. The government had a report on trying to make appointments to statutory authorities more merit-based. It's had it now for 2.5 years. We're unfortunately not allowed to see it, and whether anyone will ever get to see it must be a moot point. Many of the recommendations of the Thodey Review in 2019 still languish in the doldrums. The Public Service Commission a year ago started off a sort of a consultation process, not very capably, about further changes to the Public Service Act. Nothing has come of that after a year. So I suppose my essential message to you is that if you want to avoid disappointment, please keep your hopes about further improvement in the public service on a very short leash. Thank you.
Yeah, it always strikes me every time a government talks about the AAT or something else being stacked, the only problem was that they didn't do the stacking. It's all solved the next time around. I'd like to now call Maria Maley, who's a senior lecturer in politics at the ANU. Maria outlines a safer workplace for Parliament, tracing the government's response to the Jenkins Review and the challenges of embedding cultural change. Thank you very much, Maria.
So one of the hardest tasks that faced the incoming Albanese government was to implement the recommendations of the Jenkins Review of Commonwealth Parliamentary Workplaces. So this Human Rights Commission review was established by the Morrison government in 2021 after some shocking revelations about misconduct, bullying and sexual harassment in the federal parliament. Because of the timing of the delivery of the report, it fell to the incoming Labor government to lead the implementation of the report's recommendations. And I say lead the implementation because the reforms had to be agreed and delivered by Parliament. But it was Labor ministers and Labor MPs who had to lead the process and had to get the legislation into Parliament and passed by Parliament, and that was no mean feat. Even though all major parties had committed to implement the recommendations, the process of designing the changes and getting agreement to them was extremely difficult. But the changes that were delivered were historic, and they represent a significant legacy, not just of the Albanese government, but of the 47th Parliament. And in the chapter I describe the changes and reforms that occurred. But the first step was to draft some codes of conduct. There were 3 codes of conduct, one for all people who enter the Parliament workspace, one for parliamentarians and one for staff. And these are historic because unlike every other parliament in Australia and probably in the world, the federal parliament had no code of conduct. But codes of conduct are meaningless without a body to enforce them and investigate breaches. And that reform was much harder to achieve because it meant creating external scrutiny of politicians' conduct and something that had not existed before. And it meant creating new powers to hold politicians accountable. So getting agreement to the design of that new body was difficult, and it took a long time. It was done by a cross-party body known as the Parliamentary Leadership Task Force, which had 3 Labor members, 3 opposition members, 1 Green senator and 1 independent MP. And while the task force had an independent chair, it was Labor's Senator Katie Gallagher who had to drive that process and gain consensus on the task force and ultimately get the legislation passed through Parliament. The task force also agreed to establish an independent HR body for Parliament with the remit to try and prevent misconduct, and that's very innovative. It's not been done, as far as I know, anywhere else in the world. So these reforms represent major changes. However, in the chapter I argue there's some critical limitations to the architecture that was put in place. There were some compromises made on the task force, which mean it's weaker and less independent of politicians than, say, the standards regime in the UK. However, the fact that an entirely new standards regime and an independent HR body were delivered in a highly adversarial environment is a major legacy of the Labor government, and it represents a historic shift in power which we can only hope will result in a lasting culture change in Parliament.
Next, now we have Andrea Wallace, who is a lecturer in the School of Business at the University of New England. Andrea explores the Papua New Guinea National Rugby League initiative, a case study in soft diplomacy that she argues was more symbolic than strategic. And of course, we saw that deal signed the other night at the grand final. So, quite looking forward.
Okay. Right, must not trip over. Right. So I spoke to Scott last year, wasn't it? And he said, write something on foreign aid. And the whole $600 million thing came out and said, well, we're going to fund this footy team for Papua New Guinea. And I thought, well, that's a bit odd. But the chapter really sort of focuses on this idea that Albanese government wants to create soft diplomacy, soft power, you know, get the feels for Papua New Guinea. So, will it work? Well, they signed their defence treaty, the Puck Treaty on Monday, but then Marapa came out and said, but you know, if there's a bit of a squabble between Australia and China, we're going to be rather non-partisan. So whether it's actually worked or not will be something to look at. But in the chapter, I sort of do argue that, I wouldn't want to say it's incompetence, but it does sort of go back to this idea that a lot of current foreign aid or these sorts of let's do things for other country decisions are really very much driven by domestic political imperatives. Governments like to be seen to be doing something. And, you know, particularly when you have the Belt and Road program coming through, it's very, very close to us. Papua New Guinea's our closest neighbour. You know, it's caused a couple of problems there in the Solomon Islands. And, you know, governments have to be seen to be proactive. And we also know that our Prime Minister really likes footy. But when you start to actually think about the decision to fund this Papua New Guinea footy team, it's not such an unusual decision. A lot of governments around the world have made some really bizarre decisions. Germany has funded a bicycle trail in Peru, but only 20% of people own a bicycle, which seems a bit odd. But the UK, their sort of Department of Foreign Affairs, funded an Ethiopian girl band, sort of based upon the Spice Girls. Then Norway, they funded a floating hotel for North Korea. Yes, this is real. Truth is always stranger than fiction. But what I sort of argue too is, in this chapter, PNG's leadership isn't stupid. They've taken our money because, hey, they really like footy too in Papua New Guinea. And they're taking China's money too. China has gone in and built things like power infrastructure, got agricultural industries and enterprises up and going. They have put a lot of work into telecommunications, you know, and I teach economics, sorry, so it is rent-seeking behaviour on the behalf of Papua New Guinea. You know, they're maximising their well-being, they've retained their flexibility. But when it comes down to the nuts and bolts, I'm very practical. I sort of think, what's the opportunity cost of that money? $600 million over 10 years. We're talking about a country that has enormously high rates of antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis. People don't really have roads to get to where they need to go. But we're doing very virtuous kinds of symbolic foreign aid. We're funding a footy team when people are dying from malnutrition. It just doesn't really seem quite right. So that really is what the chapter's about. I sort of finish off with some questions, and it seems like on Monday it sort of answered a couple of those questions. Will PNG be on our side? Well, they're doing a 50-50. Who's giving them the best deal? And will sort of having a footy team in Papua New Guinea actually be this nation-building event that James Marapa says? We're talking about a country that doesn't have the infrastructure for people to go from A to B that easily, in a country where there's something like 839 languages spoken at any given time. Building a nation in a country like that is going to take a whole heap more than Australia buying them a footy team. But that's really probably what the chapter's about. You have to read it, it's very exciting. It's probably about as exciting as what Paddy described his. But anyway, lots of things to think about with that. Right, you go. Bye.
In a moment, we're going to do a bit of musical chairs and move everyone into a position where hopefully they can see each other. Like I say, keep thinking about questions. And can I say to the academics and intellectuals among you, talk yourselves up. You know, so you can learn a couple of things from journalists. It's going to be a fantastic article. All right, I'll get Scott to come forward again and just close the formal presentations by talking to us about analysing royal commissions and public inquiries as tools increasingly used to target political opponents. Scott.
Thanks. Some of you may or may not know that I'm interested in royal commissions and public inquiries. Some people collect stamps, I collect royal commissions, okay? And so I looked at 3 inquiries set up by the Albanese government. The Robo-Debt Royal Commission, the second one was the Virginia Bell inquiry into Mr Morrison accumulating all those ministerial powers, which his colleagues didn't seem to know about, which I find odd. And the third one was the COVID inquiry, okay? Now, the issue about all this is each one of these inquiries really had a target of Mr Morrison and the Morrison government. Now, governments do appoint sometimes inquiries and royal commissions into the previous mob, okay? Malcolm Fraser, to his credit, did not appoint a royal commission into the overseas loans affair, okay? Which maybe have revealed things he didn't want revealed, but he promised the GG not to do it and he didn't. But other governments have. Tony Abbott appointed a royal commission into the home insulation thing and into the trade union thing, which John Howard said was, well, you know, a bit revengeful, Tony, okay? So governments got to be careful when they appoint these sort of inquiries. Now the Robo-Debt Royal Commission, there was a question is, should we have had a Royal Commission into the Robo-Debt when the Robo-Debt scheme had A, been stopped, B, people have been compensated, okay, C, the Prime Minister had given a sort of an apology, okay, I think it's a grudging apology to it, okay, but my criteria was that enough? And to me, even though Mr Morrison's a target here, he was the Treasurer and then he's the Prime Minister and Social Security Minister, all the thing, lots of things here. Well, did anyone get smacked on for making so many mistakes? I do find, as someone who's worked in government, unbelievable that no one said that this could be illegal. I just find that, unbelievable. No one in the cabinet process, no public servant briefing a minister said, this could be illegal, you know, might be a little bit, you know. I thought it pretty fundamental. So I thought that, yes, this was, got a touch of a bit of revenge going on here, but there were issues that had to be explored. I regarded the Robo-Debt Royal Commission as a legitimate Royal Commission. There were things that, how did we get to such a stupid arrangement? Not as bad as the postal crisis in the United Kingdom, by the way, which people might contest, and I'm happy to argue that point. But yes, that Royal Commission was due. Now, the second issue was, going back to COVID and that terrible pandemic and all the idiotic things that governments did based on non-evidence, there was a lot of discussion, should we have a Royal Commission into the pandemic? Mr Albanese at his press club in February 2022 said he would probably have a Royal Commission into the pandemic and so on, which is, if you may read anything in the Canberra Times, I write about ad nauseum about this issue. And the opposition, the Liberal Party opposition, never sort of got on my bandwagon to support this. I think maybe they didn't want certain things revealed. But so we had a Royal Commission into robo-debt announced in August 2022, right? Where some of those things had been resolved. We didn't get an inquiry into COVID until 2023. Now, during COVID, 20,000 people have died. We've had businesses closed down, and we didn't get a Royal Commission, right? And we got a watered down inquiry, headed by some competent people, criticised in some cases for being a bit too close to certain viewpoints about the thing. And I do believe that the Albanese hoped, like governments sometimes do, this will be a good fishing expedition and will expose some problems. We had the Peter Shergold review, which said that Australia did some things right. Now, the media attacked that particular inquiry for not being a Royal Commission and had that central clause that would not look at things that the state governments did. Who was responsible for health? States. Who's responsible for security and policing? States. Who closed the borders? States. It seems odd you have an inquiry into COVID, you don't look at the states. But to the credit of Robin Cook, who chaired it, it did say some things that I think Mr Albanese company weren't that happy with. It did criticise some of the states. It actually said Mr Morrison acted sometimes appropriately and in the right time frame. There were some things Australia got wrong and so on. So where does it rate? 7 out of 10. It was better than we thought it was going to be. It wasn't quite the attack on poor old Mr Morrison that people expected. We still haven't got a pandemic Royal Commission. New Zealand has got one, by the way. England's got one. Sweden, of course, everyone likes to quote on things. They had an ongoing running commission of inquiry throughout the whole process, chaired by a Supreme Court judge, experts, and even a Lutheran minister of religion on it to look up the ethics of it. But they could produce one. We still have not had a proper inquiry, and everyone's even forgotten about some of the mistakes of the pandemic. Then we come to the Virginia Bell inquiry. Did Mr Morrison, was he naughty in accumulating all those powers? And I regard this one as a revenge inquiry, okay? The Solicitor General had already issued a report that there was nothing unconstitutional or illegal in what he did. Stupid maybe, but if we had an inquiry every time a politician was stupid, we'd never stop. And so we had this inquiry which had no powers, no statutory powers, no protection of witnesses about what could come forth. And so this to me was a setup. This was a setup. And you get someone talking for 55 pages, who's a former High Court judge, talking about responsible government and all that sort of stuff. That's all wonderful, and didn't really tell us anything at all very much. So, robo-debt, definitely we need a robo-debt Royal Commission. Catherine Holmes from Queensland, she'd run the Royal Commission into Queensland floods, some hashes about that. But it did say some important things. Some people have been referred to further action about did they act properly or not. I think that's good, and it's exposed about some of those decisions. And Andrew Podger is here, wrote a very good paper for that Royal Commission, saying what I've long been saying, like he has, the public service has become politicised, and that's half the problem that went on. No one was going to say, that's a dumb idea, Minister. That's one of the problems. The COVID inquiry was better than we expected, did say some certain things, made some recommendations, and I think surprised everyone about that. And I think the chair of that requires some credit for the way she didn't quite go by the terms of reference. So big tick, I thought. The third one I thought was revenge inquiry. Let's try, and most people don't know what responsible government is, by the way. They think, if you ask their people in the street, they think it's about government being responsible. It's not about government being responsible at all. So that to me was a bit of a furphy, and I think we didn't get, I still think there ought to be a proper review of the pandemic, and we didn't get one, as the Australian Financial Review and other people said, because the 5 states and territories that were running the pandemic were Labor states. So that's why we didn't get one, because that's where a lot of damage was done by some of their stupid decisions. People talk about rights, well, a lot of rights were lost unnecessarily during that process. Thank you.